In the quiet, well-manicured suburbs where success is measured in square footage and the shine of a luxury car, a different kind of story was unfolding. It wasn't a story of ambition or achievement. No, this was something darker, something that crept into a family's life, silent and unseen, for a very, very long time. For 37 years, a shadow lingered over the life of a man named Richard, a millionaire who seemed to have it all. But what is all? Does it include peace? Does it include safety? He would soon learn in the most painful way possible that it did not. This shadow had a name, Linda. And in her mind, she and Richard were destined to be together. It was a belief she held with the fierce conviction of a zealot. A belief that would fuel an obsession so profound, so relentless, it would span nearly 4 decades. It began long before the age of smartphones and instant messages. It started with a look, a brief encounter, a seed of fantasy planted in the fertile ground of a lonely heart. A seed that would grow into a twisted, suffocating vine, wrapping itself around every aspect of Richard's existence, threatening to pull him and his entire world down into the darkness with it. Imagine a single thought, just one. Now imagine that thought repeating itself. Every day, every hour, for 37 years. It becomes more than a thought, doesn't it? It becomes a reality, at least for the person thinking it. For Linda, the reality was a life with Richard. A life he was already living with someone else, his wife, Sarah. But facts like these were mere inconveniences, obstacles to be overcome. In the grand narrative she had written for herself, Sarah was a temporary character. Linda, she believed, was the protagonist, the true love, the one who had been waiting and waiting and waiting. And so, the story began. Not with a bang, but with a whisper, a quiet fixation that simmered beneath the surface of everyday life. A secret held by one woman, a secret that would eventually erupt into a torrent of digital desperation, exposing the fragile line between love and madness. It's a story that makes you wonder about the people you pass on the street, the ones who seem perfectly normal. What stories are they telling themselves? And how far will they go to make those stories come true? It's a chilling thought, isn't it? Richard was a man who had built an empire from the ground up. He was sharp, driven, and by all accounts, a decent man. He met his wife Sarah in college, and together they had built a life, a real life. One with 2 children, a beautiful home, and the kind of shared history that creates an unbreakable bond. They were a team. Richard was the provider, the rock. Sarah was the heart of the family, the one who turned their house into a home. They had weathered storms together, celebrated triumphs, and were looking forward to a peaceful future, enjoying the fruits of their long labor. They were, in essence, the picture of the American dream. Then came Linda. She entered Richard's world not as a lover, but as a brief acquaintance at a business conference in the late 1980s. She was a junior associate at a company his firm was considering a partnership with. They spoke for maybe 15 minutes. It was professional, it was polite, it was, for Richard, utterly forgettable. He was focused on the business at hand, on the numbers, on the strategy. He shook her hand, exchanged pleasantries, and moved on with his day, his week, his life. He likely never gave her a second thought, a fleeting interaction in a sea of countless others. But for Linda, that brief encounter was anything but forgettable. It was a moment of pure electricity, a spark. In her eyes, Richard wasn't just a successful businessman. He was a figure of immense power and charisma. He represented everything she felt was missing in her own life. Stability, success, a certain kind of idealized masculinity she had only seen in movies. In those 15 minutes, she didn't just see a potential business partner. She saw a soulmate. She saw her future, a future that, in her mind, had just been written in the stars. It was a moment of profound, life-altering significance for her. And so, the 2 participants of that mundane meeting walked away with 2 vastly different interpretations. For Richard, it was a closed file, a forgotten handshake. For Linda, it was the opening chapter of an epic romance. She held on to the memory of his smile, the sound of his voice, the feeling of his handshake. She replayed the conversation over and over in her mind, embellishing it, adding layers of meaning that were never there. She began to build a fantasy, brick by imaginary brick, with Richard at its very center, a fantasy that would soon demand to become reality. In the beginning, the obsession was a quiet, private affair, a secret fire that Linda tended to in the solitude of her own life. In the years following that conference, she would occasionally send a letter to Richard's office, a holiday card, a note congratulating him on a business deal she'd read about in the paper. To Richard and his staff, these were just the courteous, if slightly unusual, gestures of a distant professional contact. They were filed away or politely discarded, barely registering on the radar of his busy life. He had no idea he was the star of a one-woman show, playing a role he had never auditioned for. As time went on, Linda's fantasy grew more elaborate. She kept tabs on him from a distance, like a devoted fan following a celebrity. She subscribed to trade journals he was featured in. She memorized the names of his children, the location of his vacation home. In her mind, she wasn't stalking. She was simply staying informed about the life of the man she was meant to be with. She saw his marriage to Sarah not as a legitimate bond, but as a temporary placeholder, a trial he had to endure before he could finally be with her. She was waiting patiently, convinced that fate and Richard would eventually come around. The transition from letters to more direct contact was gradual. With the dawn of the internet, her methods evolved. She found his email address. The messages started as professional check-ins, but slowly, their tone began to shift. They became more personal, more familiar. She would mention inside jokes that only she was in on, referencing their one and only meeting from years ago as if it were a cherished shared memory. Richard, when he saw them, would mostly ignore them, perhaps feeling a flicker of unease but brushing it off as the work of a lonely, slightly eccentric person. What harm could a few strange emails do? This slow, creeping escalation is the hallmark of such obsessions. It's like a tide coming in, so gradual you don't notice your feet are wet until the water is up to your knees. Each boundary crossed was a small one. A letter, an email, a comment on a public article. Each unanswered message was not a rejection in her mind, but a test of her devotion. Her resolve only hardened. For over 2 decades, this was the pattern. A slow burn. A one-way correspondence fueled by a powerful and increasingly dangerous delusion. The world was changing, technology was advancing, and Linda's obsession was about to find a powerful new weapon. The invention of the smartphone was the turning point. It was the key that unlocked a new, terrifying level of obsession. Suddenly, Linda had a direct line to Richard's pocket. His personal number, likely obtained through a data broker or a moment of social engineering, became her primary tool, and she used it with a relentless, staggering ferocity. The slow drip of letters and emails became a flood, a digital deluge that would come to define the final, most intense years of her 37-year fixation. A constant, buzzing reminder that she was there, always there, waiting, watching. The numbers themselves are hard to comprehend. Over 57,000 text messages. That's an average of dozens of texts every single day, for years on end. They arrived at all hours. A cheerful, "Good morning, my love," at 6 a.m. A demanding, "Why aren't you answering me?" at 3 p.m. A desperate, pleading, "I know you feel it too," at 2 a.m. The messages were a chaotic mix of emotions. One moment they were filled with declarations of undying love and detailed plans for their future life together. The next, they were laced with vitriol, accusing him of cruelty, calling his wife horrible names, and threatening to expose their secret love to the world. This wasn't a conversation. It was a monologue, a stream of consciousness broadcast directly into Richard's life. He rarely, if ever, replied. On the advice of security consultants, he was told that any response, even a "please stop," would be seen as encouragement. It would be proof that he was listening. So he endured it in silence. His phone, a tool for business and connection, became a source of constant anxiety. Every buzz, every notification sent a jolt of dread through him. Was it her again? What would it say this time? It was a form of psychological water torture, delivered one text message at a time. Imagine the sheer dedication, the time and energy required to send that many messages. While Richard was running his company, having dinner with his family, or trying to sleep, Linda was there, fingers flying across a tiny screen, pouring her entire being into these digital missives. The texts were her reality. Each one sent was a confirmation of her own narrative. She wasn't a stranger harassing a man. She was a woman fighting for her great love. The 57,000 texts were not a sign of obsession. To her, they were 57,000 love letters, waiting for a reply that would never come. The obsession, which had once been a distant annoyance for Richard, began to poison every corner of his life. It was no longer a secret he could carry alone. The sheer volume of the harassment made it impossible to hide. His wife, Sarah, saw the strain on his face. She noticed how he would flinch every time his phone buzzed, the way his mood would instantly darken. The peace of their home, their sanctuary from the world, was being violated. The digital noise from Linda's phone was an intruder in their marriage, an unwelcome guest at their dinner table. Sarah, a strong and resilient woman, was now a target herself. In Linda's texts, she was the villain. The obstacle. Linda would send Richard hateful messages about his wife, filled with cruel insults and baseless accusations. Sometimes, Linda would even find ways to contact Sarah directly, sending veiled threats or disturbing messages to her social media. The family felt like they were under siege. They began to fear for their safety. Was Linda just a lonely woman behind a keyboard? Or was she capable of something more? That question hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The emotional toll was immense. Richard was consumed by a mixture of anger, fear, and a strange, misplaced sense of guilt. He replayed that 15-minute meeting from 1987 over and over. Had he said something wrong? Smiled too warmly? He knew logically that he had done nothing to encourage this, but logic has little power against such a relentless assault. He became withdrawn, paranoid. He changed his number multiple times, but Linda always found the new one. The feeling of helplessness was crushing. He was a powerful man, a millionaire, but he was powerless to stop one woman and her phone. Their children, now adults, were also drawn into the nightmare. They worried constantly about their parents' safety and well-being. Family gatherings were tinged with anxiety. The simple joy of being together was stolen by the constant, unspoken presence of the woman who haunted their lives. The obsession was no longer just about Richard. It was an attack on the entire family unit. It targeted the very foundation of their lives, their sense of security, their peace, and their love for one another. Linda wasn't just trying to win Richard. She was trying to dismantle the life he had built without her. For years, Richard and his family tried to handle the situation privately. They hired security consultants, they spoke to lawyers, they documented everything. But they hesitated to go to the police. Why? It's a question many people ask. Part of it was a desire to avoid public spectacle. Richard was a well-known figure in his community, and the thought of his family's private torment becoming tabloid fodder was horrifying. There was also a sense that perhaps she would just stop. That one day, the obsession would burn itself out. That she would finally move on. It was a hope they clung to, even as the evidence mounted against it. The first major turning point came when Linda escalated from digital harassment to physical proximity. She began showing up in their town. She was seen driving slowly past their house. She appeared at a restaurant where Richard and Sarah were having dinner, sitting at a nearby table, just staring. The line had been crossed. This was no longer just about texts and emails. The digital ghost had manifested in the real world, and the threat felt immediate and terrifying. The family installed a state-of-the-art security system, but it did little to calm their shattered nerves. The sanctuary of their home had been breached. The final straw, the event that finally pushed them to go public, was a package that arrived at Richard's office. It wasn't threatening in a violent way, but it was deeply disturbing. Inside was a photo album, a wedding album. It was filled with pictures of Richard, taken from magazines and online articles, crudely photoshopped next to pictures of Linda. There were captions detailing their first date, their engagement, and their wedding day. It was a physical manifestation of her delusion. a tangible, terrifying glimpse into the depths of her alternate reality. It was the moment Richard and Sarah knew this would never stop on its own. Faced with this undeniable evidence of a complete break from reality, they knew they had no other choice. Their hope for a private resolution was gone. Their fear for their safety had become overwhelming. With their lawyer, they compiled everything. The 37 years of letters, the thousands of emails, the 57,000 text messages, the photos of her near their home, the grotesque wedding album. They took the mountain of evidence to the authorities. The story of their long, silent torment was about to become very, very public. The breaking point had been reached, and the consequences would finally unfold. So, what drives a person to sustain an obsession for 37 years? To build an entire life around a 15-minute encounter? Psychologists often point to something called erotomania, a delusional disorder where an individual believes that another person, usually of a higher social status, is in love with them. For the person suffering from this delusion, every action or inaction from the object of their affection is interpreted as a secret message. An unanswered text isn't a rejection, it's a test of faith. A public sighting isn't a coincidence, it's a secret rendezvous. The delusion builds its own fortress of confirmation, brick by brick. This kind of long-term fixation often stems from a profound sense of emptiness and a fragile identity. Linda's life, outside of her obsession with Richard, was reportedly unremarkable. She had a series of unfulfilling jobs and few close relationships. Richard became the focal point of her existence, a grand project that gave her life meaning and purpose. The fantasy of being with him was more compelling, more vibrant than her own reality. In her mind, she wasn't just Linda, an ordinary woman. She was Linda, the secret love of a powerful millionaire, the heroine of a grand romance. Technology played a crucial role as an accelerant. In the past, an obsession like this might have been limited by logistics. The effort of writing and mailing letters, the cost of long-distance calls. But the internet and smartphones removed all barriers. They created an illusion of intimacy and access. Linda could see Richard's life through social media and news articles. She could talk to him at any moment via text. This constant digital connection fed the delusion, making the fantasy feel more real and immediate than ever before. It was like pouring gasoline on a fire that had already been smoldering for decades. And why does it last so long? Because letting go of the obsession would mean confronting the void it was meant to fill. It would mean accepting a reality that felt empty and disappointing. For Linda, giving up on Richard would be like giving up on life itself. The obsession became her identity. The 37-year quest was the story she told herself about who she was. To abandon it would be to admit that her life's great work was based on a lie. And for some, that is a truth too painful to face, making them cling to the delusion, no matter the cost to themselves or others. When the story finally broke, the legal system moved swiftly. Armed with an overwhelming mountain of evidence, Richard was granted a lifetime restraining order. The legal document was stark and clear, ordering Linda to cease all contact and stay hundreds of yards away from Richard, his home, his business, and his family. The public nature of the court proceeding served as a harsh spotlight, dragging the 37-year fantasy into the cold, hard light of day. For the first time, there was a real, enforceable consequence for her actions. The digital deluge finally ran dry. For Richard and Sarah, the silence that followed was both a relief and deeply unsettling. After so many years of constant noise, its absence was deafening. They could finally put their phones down without fear. They could have dinner without looking over their shoulders, but the scars remained. The sense of safety, once taken for granted, was now something they had to consciously rebuild. The emotional toll of decades of harassment doesn't simply vanish with a court order. It leaves an echo, a lingering shadow of anxiety that takes a long, long time to fade. And what of Linda? The court order forced her to confront the collapse of her life's central narrative. Without the ability to contact Richard, the fantasy she had so carefully constructed for 37 years was severed from its source. We are left to wonder about the immense void that must have opened up in her life. What happens when the only thing that has given your life meaning is taken away? We can only hope that this legal intervention was the beginning of her receiving the psychological help she so clearly and desperately needed for so long. Her story is not just one of a villain, but also of a tragedy. Ultimately, this haunting tale serves as a powerful cautionary lesson. It shows us the terrifying power of a delusion and the profound vulnerability we all have in a digitally connected world. It forces us to ask that difficult question: where is the line between devotion and delusion? Between love and obsession? Richard and Sarah's story is a testament to the resilience of a family under unimaginable pressure. And it's a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not those that hide in the dark, but the ones that live inside a fantasy, relentlessly texting, just waiting for a reply.